Welcome back to All Is Not Lost. I'm your host, Rianne Maldonado. We often hear about people whose psychic or mediumistic abilities surface or awaken after a traumatic event. What constitutes a traumatic event will be different for each person. For some, it's a major accident or a near-death experience. And for others, it can be an abusive situation during childhood. In today's episode, I share the traumatic experience I had that made me realize my gift. I won't say this event caused my gift because I always knew that I was different, but I do credit it with helping me realize and eventually choose to develop my gift further into what it is today.
Spirit. Does it stay? Does it go?
The fact is, spirit does survive death. Our loved ones are all around us. Love survives. Spirit survives. All is not lost.
Welcome to the All Is Not Lost podcast. Here's your host, psychic and evidential medium, Rianne Maldonado.
People always love to ask how or when I knew I was a medium. And it's such a strange question to answer. I mean, it seems straightforward, right? Like a lot of mediums you read about or hear about, they say that their gift was awoken by some big tragedy, like a major car accident or a near-death experience, something like that. Others, but far less, I believe, are just born seeing and knowing things. So that's kind of not what I'm talking about today. I know that I have been different my entire life. The way I describe it is that I think I was normal in that I had friends and family and good relationships, and I would play with my friends, and I had pets and all the normal things we do as children, usually. However, there was a part of me that always felt like I was standing just a little bit on the outside of a bubble, looking in. So although part of me was there being active and involved and playing with my friends and doing the normal teenager things and stuff like that as time went on, I still also felt like there was this separate part of me that was watching everything as it was taking place. I also remember always feeling like I was from another planet, like I felt like my parents didn't really understand me and I didn't really understand them. That's not uncommon, I'm sure, for lots of kids, especially teenagers, but this was a little bit different. I just never felt like I really, really fit in anywhere, even though I had positive relationships in my life. So there were also times that I would know things, like some precognition. I would just know stuff out of the blue, or I'm using air quotes here, guess about things about my friends or my family, when really I guess it wasn't a guess. It was coming from spirit. I just didn't know that. I also know that as I grew up, I did feel the presence of spirit around me. I didn't see spirit more than, sometimes there would be a shadow out of the corner of my eye, but when you're a kid, that's just scary or not, those kind of things. But as I got older, I do know that I felt that my grandfather was around me, in particular homes I lived in, or he would visit me in my dreams. And that's a topic for another day, dream visits, because they're very, very different than a normal dream, if you are experiencing a dream visit from a loved one. So that's a great topic for another day. But when people like to ask me when I first knew I was a medium, it's really an interesting and tragic story. Not technically tragic for me in the way that you might be thinking. I did not have a near-death experience. I did not have a major car accident or something like that. I did have what I would call a tragic event in my life. And now that I help people with paranormal things in their homes or psychokinetic things, meaning things moving around in your home inexplicably, I I feel I can empathize quite well because the trauma I felt living in a house like that is what brought about my mediumship. So I understand how scary and traumatic that can be for people sometimes. So it starts with 2013. My family and I wanted to move from a small town in Idaho across the border into Spokane, Washington. And we were looking for houses on Craigslist. At that time, we were still renting. And my husband and I found a house that looked like it would be perfect for us. We had small children and we found one that looked perfect. And so we went to the house to meet the owner. And it was the strangest thing I've ever felt. I remember it was a snowy, freezing cold morning, and he opened the door. And I don't even think I had my foot in the door yet when I said to my husband, we need to rent this house. We're supposed to live here. And so we continued on with the walkthrough and getting to know the owner a little bit. And we took the application and explained our situation and all that, stuff you do when you're going to rent a house. And we went about our way, but I couldn't stop thinking about that house and I couldn't wait to get moved in. I can't pinpoint anything about the house. I will explain later what I figured out that it was, but it's not like there was something extra beautiful or usable about the house that made me think, oh, we've got to have this house. It was more just a knowing, just a feeling inside that we belonged there. And so we moved in and got settled and all of that. And then it wasn't very long before strange and uncomfortable things began happening. And they were subtle at first. It was more just shifts in energy, shifts in relationships. I remember that my husband and I started really not getting along. One of our children, she wouldn't sleep, not because of fear or anything, it seemed. She would just wander the house all night long. We'd put her to bed and she couldn't sleep and she'd be wandering around at 11, 12 o'clock at night. And I'd open my eyes at 4 a.m. and she'd be already up doing whatever. Things would move inexplicably. Our moods were not great. It was just kind of began to feel yucky, for lack of a better word. It just was, we weren't happy like we thought we would be. A lot of emotional turmoil and things like that. We tried to live normally. We had parties with friends over. We had play groups because our kids were still little. We tried to behave normally, but there was this undercurrent of unhappiness and unsettledness. Now, this house had 4 levels, technically. When you walk in the door, there was basically 2 living rooms, and one was a few steps down from the first one, and the kitchen. And then the upstairs were all the bedrooms, except way downstairs, there was a basement room, a finished basement with, you could be a living room or whatever. And off of that room was another bedroom. That's where our son, who was in high school at the time, that became his room. And then there was the creepiest furnace room down there, kind of like a storage room where there was some shelving where you could put, Christmas decorations and things you're not going to use every day. So I didn't like going down there. I really didn't like going down there. And in fact, none of us did. We thought we'd make that basement room a playroom, but the kids never wanted to go down there. Now our son, he felt fine in his bedroom with his door closed. So anyway, there was a lot of mixed feelings in this house. But it was our house for 2.5 years, and we just did the best with it. But this one day, let me back up. In February of 2015, my husband was looking for a new job. He was really unsatisfied at his job, and they were making some changes, and he was worried, along with lots of the other employees, that they were going to be let go with this merger that was happening. So he was being proactive, looking for a new job. And he had dreams of going back to California and living closer to our families where we're, both originally from. And I didn't want to go, but I was being a supportive wife and everything. And so when he got a call that he was offered this job in California, he was beyond excited. So he needed to move right away to start this job. And I couldn't leave yet with the kids because our son was about to graduate in May, and one of our daughters was going to finish kindergarten in May. And so it made more sense for me to stay behind and take care of everything, and for him to go to California and get situated. And then after graduation, we were going to meet up and move down to California together. Well, it was interesting because after he left, once he moved out, even stranger things began happening. Everything really amplified. For example, I went to get my daughter up from her nap so we could go out for dinner, me and all the kids. And we had a baby monitor on the wall, a video baby monitor, and it was pointed at her crib always. And it was up high on the wall so we could look down into her crib and make sure she's safe. Well, when we got home from dinner and I went to put her to bed, the baby monitor was pointing at the ceiling. So that's one example of some strange movement. There were a few other things that day that just didn't sit right. And so I called my husband in California because he's a retired policeman. And I asked him if he would call the police to come, look through the house. I didn't want to be looked at like a crazy woman because, let's admit it, oftentimes women are treated that way. If you're scared of something or suspect something, but you don't really have proof, it's like, oh, there's a crazy lady. Well, my husband, having been a policeman himself, I thought, well, that'd be so much better if he called. And he did. And a police officer did come over and searched our house, went down in the basement, looked at everything. And there was nobody in the house and no evidence of anybody breaking into the house. So we don't know, at that point, what was going on. We just know that some scary stuff was happening. There was also, after my husband left, our garage door. We had a 2-car garage and a 1-car garage. And behind the one garage door, we kept our trash cans that would go out every Tuesday or whatever. And the whole time we lived there, the garage door opener worked just fine. Never had a problem with it. Well, the first Tuesday after my husband moved out, I went to take the trash out and the garage door would not open. And it just made this horrible, scary, like grinding sound as the motor was trying to pull the door open and it just wouldn't open. And so that was strange and spooky at the time because remember, we're adding up almost 2.5 years of strange occurrences. And by now I had this huge list of experiences that I had had in this house. And so each time something scary happened or weird, or even just remotely weird, I would add it to that list of, I don't know what the hell is going on in this house, but I don't like it. There was another really terrifying event before my husband left, actually, when I'm pretty sure he thought I was a complete lunatic. And looking back, I would have thought that too. And it's funny, I was telling this story the other day, and my 13-year-old and 11-year-old were listening to me tell this story. And both of them said, "Oh my God, Mom, that has to be true because you would never say anything like that." So anyway, if any of you out there are parents, and especially the moms who come home from the hospital with a new baby, sometimes the first few nights at home are a little awkward. You don't really know like where you're going to sleep. You have this crib, but babies don't often go right in their cribs right away. And we co-slept with all of our babies, but until I got to know them and the routine of each child and my comfort level, sometimes I would spend the first few nights with them by myself, so my husband could get some sleep until I kind of figured out what was going on. And so this particular time, it was May of 2014, and I gave birth to our daughter. And we brought her home. And I said to my husband that night, you know what? You guys just go ahead and sleep upstairs. I'm going to sleep on the couch. And we had this little low coffee table that was the perfect height of the couch. And it had three sides to it, like a little magazine table from an old doctor's office kind of deal. And so I had one of those contoured changing table pads that fit perfectly on the coffee table. So I pulled that up close, flush with the couch, and I swaddled our baby and I put her right there next to me. And I said, I'm just going to sleep here on the couch. And then when she wakes up to nurse, I'll be ready for her. Well, didn't quite go as planned. I say this, it's very hard for me to say this because I have my own belief system and I know everybody out there has their own belief system. And so I'm trying to choose my words carefully, but I'm going to speak freely on how I felt. So as I'm laying there, I had the most horrible, horrible feeling. Now, I don't believe in possession. I don't believe spirits can possess our bodies at all. I know others do, and that's fine. But at the time, I especially didn't believe it. So when I all of a sudden felt, I'm going to give the visual, I felt as if there was some black, misty, smoky entity. I don't know what, just some black energy. And I felt like it started at the base of my skull, at the top of my spine, and it went whoosh and went down my spine and out the bottom of my spine. I felt like something was trying to suck out my energy, my soul. I don't know. I don't know what. I just know that it was this horrible, uncomfortable, terrifying feeling that my body was being robbed of something. And I had no control over it. And as parents, as I said before, or I say this to other mothers, when you have a new baby or any child, you'd never leave your baby somewhere that's scary or unsafe. And I was so terrified. I wasn't even thinking. I jumped off the couch and I flew up the stairs. I don't even remember the process. I just know I flew. And I was screaming the whole way up the stairs, get the baby, get the baby, get the baby. And I ran in my room and I woke up my husband and I just said, go downstairs and get the baby, go get the baby. I didn't even have time or the words to tell him what I was feeling. But he ran down and got the baby, who was perfectly fine and sleeping through all of this. She didn't even wiggle at all. But we get to the bedroom and I told him what happened. And of course, he dismissed it at the time and told me I was just probably having a bad dream, trying to make me feel better, but really making me feel worse. And so I told him that we were going to spend the rest of the night there in the bed with him and I was not going to have my back to the door. And so we cradled the baby between us and I tried to go to sleep. But that was probably the most frightening experience of my entire life. And I had nobody to tell. I felt crazy. My husband thought I was nuts. And again, like I said, we were already not getting along very well in this house. So it was just an all around bad situation. But I put it behind me and I went on focusing on my kids and my life and doing all those things. Well, so after he moved out and these weird things were amping up, it was just getting more and more uncomfortable to live there. But I had a deadline. I had an end date. I knew when it was going to be over and all of that. Well, there was this one particular day that I will never forget because it was the very beginning. And looking back now, I realized that part of this event was when I believe that I got my very first really clear, accurate, clairaudient message from Spirit. Before then, it had been random. I didn't know what I was getting. I didn't even know I was psychic. I didn't know I was a medium. I didn't know any of this. So the information that I would get periodically was very unharnessed and random. But looking back at this situation, I can pinpoint. And so it's kind of a positive now. Anyway, I laid my youngest down for a nap that day. My son and daughter were at school. and I had one other daughter who was having a little tea party on the porch. And I noticed that my baby was sleeping longer and longer and longer than normal, and I was going to be late to pick up my kids. And finally, I waited till the very last minute before waking her up to go and get my other kids. And once I got her in the car and I got my other daughter in the car, I went to start my car and it wouldn't start. It just wouldn't start. It wouldn't even turn over. I was in a sheer panic. I had no family in Idaho or Washington. My husband had moved to California. I knew nobody. I failed to mention to you earlier that in the years we lived in this house, not one neighbor had ever spoken to us. None. Not one neighbor had come to greet us. Most didn't even wave at us. It was very, very strange. But I had no support system. So in my sheer panic, I grab up my kids back out of the car and I run over to my neighbor's house, the direct neighbor next to me. And I knocked on her door and I introduced myself. And I vaguely remember saying something like, I know you don't know me, but I live next door and I'm desperate. My car won't start and I need to pick up my kids from school. And I noticed you have a minivan. And she was wonderful. She said, sure, let me get the keys. And she brought the car over and we loaded the car seats in the car and loaded the kids. And mind you, my mental state right now, I am frazzled. I'm late to get my children. I'm worried about my car and what's wrong with it and how to get it fixed. I'm stressed from waking my baby up and dragging them in and out of different cars. It was just not a good moment for me right then. And I don't think we were 30 feet down the driveway, hadn't even turned the corner onto the main street when she looked over at me from the driver's seat and she said, how are you living in that house? And I remember saying, stop. I put my hand up and I said, stop. Whatever you have to say about my house, now is not the time. I don't want to hear it. Let's just keep going to get my kids. Because, your imagination is worse than the truth. And now my mind was reeling and I thought, of all things, this is what I don't need today. But then I looked at her and I'm like, okay, what are you talking about? And that's when she told me that I was basically living in a house of horrors. That was her words. And she explained that's why none of the neighbors ever wanted to talk to us and why she had tinfoil on all her windows that faced my house. And she went on and on to tell me how this big tragedy had happened in our house. And I asked her to not give me the details. I just said, I still have to live here for a few months. Please don't tell me any of the details. I can't deal with this right now. But as she's talking and driving, I'm texting my husband in California, telling him what she's just told me. And mind you, I don't want my daughter in the backseat to hear something scary about her house. She was only 3, but she was a very smart girl and she paid attention. Well, my husband didn't text back. He called back. And that was almost worse because he must have, I know he pulled up the news article about what had happened. And he said, I want you to get on a plane and come here. I want you guys to leave now. And that was even more terrifying because what the heck could be so urgent that I would have to literally pack up the kids, blow off my son's graduation and get in the car now. But later I realized that my husband had been having experiences in the house as well. He just never told me because he wanted to ignore them and rationalize them and make them go away. But I think once he read the news story, he realized that he wasn't imagining the things that were happening and that I wasn't crazy and that it would probably just be best to get the hell out of that house. But it wasn't possible, in all reality. There's no way I could have just left everything right then. I had to kind of suffer through it. And so we picked up the other 2 kids. And when my son got in the car, finally, I was very late to the high school to pick him up. I didn't want to talk in front of my kindergartner. So I handed him my phone and let him read the text that I sent to my husband. And his face just went white because, what do you do with this information? So what happened is that we were renting this house from a man who had purchased it after the tragedy. So the old owner of the house had lived there with his fiance and her two boys. And from what I've learned, they were twins and one was autistic. And apparently the autistic boy created some trouble in the relationship. And so when the woman decided to move out with her boys and get her own place, she moved down the road into a condo with her sons. Well, the man who owned our house wasn't very happy with that. And he went over to her house and he killed her and he killed one of the boys. I was told later he wanted to kill the autistic boy, but unfortunately, well, either way, both is unfortunate. He killed the other boy. I say unfortunately because it's tragic to have this autistic boy left now with no mother, no brother, nobody. It's heartbreaking. And then he drove home and he killed himself in our garage. Interestingly, on the same side of the garage that the door stopped working the day my husband moved out. So that night, needless to say, I was completely raw. I was a bundle of nerves. I didn't know if I wanted to go to a hotel. I didn't know if I wanted to go to a friend's house. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should feed my kids dinner. Like my mind was just completely swirling. And I did have one friend who came to try to help me and lend me her car as well. So that was great. But I was just a mess. So that night I decided to stay at the house because the baby was still very accustomed to sleeping in her crib at this point, and I wanted to keep her as normal as possible, hoping that we could all get some sleep. I did make all the other kids sleep in my room, including my son. It was like a big sleepover. Everybody just had a sleeping bag on the floor. And I remember I didn't get one wink of sleep. I sat up in my bed and I just waited for the sun to rise. My eyes were blurry. My nerves were shot. I was just an utter mess, but I was sitting there waiting for the sun to come up. And when I said earlier that I can pinpoint my very first true clairaudient message from spirit, it was during that night. I was sitting there in my bed, staring out the window, also staring towards the shower of that master bathroom, because for all the time I lived there, I hated our shower. There was just some creepy energy there. So I sat up all night looking at my kids. Mind was wandering, feeling like I could hear things. Nothing was different. It was just now I was aware. So then you feel crazy because you're like, well, nothing has changed. It's not like the murderer is here physically, so I felt silly. But on the other hand, I now had an explanation for all the weird crap that was happening. So as I'm sitting there in bed, I remember I got this super, super clear direction that I needed to go talk to my daughter's principal. I just kept hearing, talk to the principal, talk to the principal. You need to talk to the principal. And I thought, well, that's freaking weird. I have no idea where this is coming from or why I'm supposed to go talk to the principal. But when the sun finally did come up and my son woke up, I looked at him and I said, you're not going to school. You're watching your sisters. I'm supposed to go talk to the principal. And he said, okay. So I got the kindergartner ready and fed everyone breakfast and whatever else we did that day. And I drove her to school. And when I got there, I stopped the principal and I said, after the kids go to class, can I chat with you for a minute? And she said, sure, wait for me in the office. So we meet up in her office a few minutes later and we both sit down. I sit across from her and I take a big breath and I look at her and I say, I think you know something about my house. And she said, well, tell me where you live. And once I told her, her head just dropped. And she took a big breath and let out a big sigh. And she said, "Yep, I sure do." And this is where I learned what happened in my house. And those boys had been students at this elementary school where my daughter was. And they were part of school functions. This family, they came around all the time. Apparently, no one saw this coming. It was like he really just snapped. And strangely, I remember thinking at the time that that slightly made me feel better. Um, I think in my mind that the thought of living in a house where somebody was just a complete psychopath and murdered people just for sport, I couldn't have dealt with that. But being there, learning that he had behaved relatively normally, had been a family person, and just snapped one day, um, was, like I said, slightly less terrifying. So I left feeling a little bit better than I had arrived. Still not great, but it was some interesting information, and it was helpful information. And I didn't even grasp at that time that I had received a message from spirit. It was years later that I realized I was told to go talk to the principal, one, for information, and two, I believe because it could ease my mind a little bit. And things started changing after that. Once people found out, oh, that's the house it happened in, all the friends who had been there for parties or play groups were just, shocked that they had spent all this time in my house with me, only to realize this was the same house they heard about on the news a few years prior. So when I'm asked, how did you know you were a medium, or when did you become a medium? This story is so long and I'm not even done with it, but this is what led up to it. Once I got to this point, I reached out to a friend of a friend of a friend on Facebook. I had heard somebody say that they were a medium. And at that point, I didn't even believe in mediums. I thought it was pure entertainment. I thought it was kind of fake and phony. Um, I liked watching some of the shows on TV with mediums, but I'm a skeptic. And so I didn't believe in it. But at this point, I had already called my son's high school. He went to a Catholic high school in Spokane, quite a famous one. And I had asked if a priest would come. And I'm not religious. I certainly wasn't Catholic, but I was desperate. I didn't know how I was going to live another few months in this house with my children alone, knowing what I knew, experiencing what I was experiencing. I was just grasping at straws. Well, the priest wouldn't come. And there's a story about that for another day. But so I reached out to a friend of a friend, and she had said she was a medium, but she wrote back to me on Facebook and said, "But I don't work with that kind of energy." And that freaked me out even more, to be honest. I didn't understand, do you talk to dead people or not? And what do you mean that kind of energy? I really just didn't know what that meant. And I was just scared. But then she said she knew someone who could help me. And she gave me the name of another medium. And I wrote her big, long message on Facebook about what happened and how I desperately needed help and had no idea what to do, or even if she could help me, but I just could not go on like this. And it was so interesting. I remember exactly where I was driving. I was on a back road to my son's high school. I was right next to a Panda Express when my phone dinged, and I was at a red light. And I looked down and I saw it was a message from her, and I pulled into the Panda Express parking lot so I could read it safely. No texting and driving. And I opened up her message, and I remember it said, "Was his name Jan?" And my mouth dropped. I was like, how the hell did she know that? Because yes, the man who had murdered his fiance and her son and himself was named Jan, and that is not a common name. In a nutshell, Brittany had been working with another family across town who ended up actually being Jan's best friend. And apparently his spirit was bothering them in the night, and they had hired Brittany to help with this, help him move along, help him stop coming to their house and bothering them and their dogs, um, things like this. But the things she was doing weren't working. Well, it looks like I was the missing piece of the puzzle. I'm living in this guy's house. So Brittany and I figure out a time that she can come over. And besides saging my house and talking to me and calming me down, she went through the entire house, and she did pick up on some other spirits, but ones that, weren't causing any trouble. But it is interesting that she felt negativity in a lot of the same areas I did. For example, my laundry area, the shower in my bathroom, she felt the same there. And so she did some cleansing and some things in there. But I remember at the end, we were sitting in my living room, and I was just so desperate to know why. Why was this happening to me? And what am I supposed to do with this information? And how do I cope? I mean, I had a million questions for her. And I'll never forget. She looked at me and she said, "Well, it's happening because you're a medium." And I laughed. I was like, "No, I'm not. That's crazy." And she said to me this: "No, mediums are like lanterns in the night, and spirits know who will listen to them and help them get their messages out." And I remember thinking, well, I don't want that job. No, thanks. This has been awful. I want nothing to do with this. And thank you very much, but no. Um, I then asked her for some recommended reading, some things that weren't scary that might help me understand or make me even believe that she was correct, that I had this ability. Because as I said previously, I always knew I was different. I always knew I was a little bit weird. Didn't know why. And if this was the reason why, it would explain so many things from my life, from my childhood, and help me. But I was worried it was always going to be scary, like what I had gone through. So I needed her to tell me that no, it's not always scary. It's not always going to be like this. And so I remember she recommended some books and things. And I joke, I like to say that I think I ordered the book before she was even out of my driveway on Amazon. So probably did. But anyway, that is really the beginning of me realizing my mediumship. It was in, spring of 2015. And for about 2 years, I really wanted nothing to do with it. I would just read various books that weren't too on the scary side. In fact, the first book I read that she did recommend to me was Ask Your Guides by Sonia Choquette. And that was a lifesaver. But I still spent the next 2 years unable to go into a room alone, especially like upstairs into our bedroom of our next house in California. I couldn't go alone. I had the kids sleep in my room every single night because my husband traveled all week long. I just was still raw, and I didn't know what to make of it. But eventually each day got easier, a little less scary. I learned more, read more, watched more shows on things like this. And fast forward, here we are 7, almost 8 years later. And now this is what I do to help people, what I do for work. And I can't imagine doing anything else. So when I think back about Jan, I used to be terrified of him and his spirit because I felt he was doing scary, harmful things. But now I think Jan was just trying to get my attention. And we might wonder, well, why? Why would Jan want to get my attention? Well, ultimately, I think it's for a few reasons. I think that it helped bring me and Brittany together so that Brittany could help this other family she'd been working with. And might sound crazy, and maybe I'm just telling myself this so I feel better, but I also think Jan reached out to me um to put me on this path. In a way, nothing will ever make up for what he did ever, but who am I? We're not here to judge. We're not the ones that can do judgment, forgiveness, all of that stuff. That's not our role, but I think that maybe he put me on this path so that I could help others as kind of a way to redeem himself a little bit. Like I said, if that's just me telling myself that to feel better about a scary situation, fine. But either way, it did put me on this path. I do help people feel better, whether it's from giving them a message from a loved one that clears up some miscommunication or some negative feelings they had about that person, or through helping people that are having some sort of activity in their house that's scaring them. Well, either way, if I'm helping them, then I think Jan putting me on this path is a positive. And I'd like to think that he saw the error of his ways and made some choices to help do things differently. I don't know. We'll never know, right? But that is, in essence, how I realized my gift. And now I can thank Jan, not for what he did, but for helping bring this to my attention. So, anyway, next time you ask somebody how they knew they were gifted with mediumship or psychic abilities, or when, just know it might not be as simple as you think. And it's going to be different for everyone. Again, not everybody has to have a traumatic event to have these abilities, but most people do. And who are we to say what's a traumatic event and what isn't? I think it's a very personal experience, but either way, I am thankful and glad to be on this path, and I can't imagine being anywhere else. Thank you so much for joining All Is Not Lost today. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please visit us at allisnotlostpodcast.com and click on Be a Guest. Until next time, this is All Is Not Lost with host Rianne Maldonado.